morning, everyone. Hope you enjoyed the show and all your parties yesterday. When I was preparing this speech, I was thinking about when I'm attendee of such a conference, what are the best speeches I want to attend? Well, first, of course, keynotes. You know, keynotes are great. Some great visionary people giving you their view on the future of the technology. It's always very enthusiastic. It's perfect. Unfortunately, I'm not that kind of guy, so don't expect it from me now. But my second favorite speech on a conference is when I see something maybe tiny, but which I can try right away, which I can open my laptop maybe during the presentation, and I can try, and it will help me in my developer stack. So this is the kind of speech I'm going to give you today. So I encourage you, if you never tried React Context and you are a React developer, maybe try right away during my speech. I will help you. Before we switch to React Context, something about my context. Well, I am Chief Technology Officer of Unicorn. Unicorn is a large system integrator operating from here, from Prague. And we have more than maybe there's 350, but now it's 400 solutions, bespoke solutions in banking, industry, automotive, telco, and of course in consumer market. Every day we have more than 2 million of users online. It's quite just great. And we have more than 2,000 IT professionals working on it in 4 countries and 19 cities. So quite a large stuff. And currently, more than half of them are front-end developers. And React is the core part of their stack. So I can say that we have one of the largest React teams here in Central Europe. I'm very proud of it. Okay, most of our developers work on a development stack we call Unicorn Mobile First IoT-ready Cloud Architecture, which is the architecture we are developing for the last 4 days. And it's focused on progressive web applications because we think there's a great future in progressive web applications. And in many industries, they will go over native applications, and it will be the only front end which you will need to develop. Of course, responsive, working on all devices, but just HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, and that's it. So we are focusing on that quite strongly, and I'm still active developer and committer in this technology. But what I want to share with you today is our experience with introducing such a new concept like React Context into this development stack, and some pros and cons we find out during this. By the way, today I'm working 25 years plus 1 day for Unicorn, because yesterday it was anniversary of my interview. So I think it's quite huge. Thank you, thank you. By the way, when I joined the company, we were 4. Now we are 2,000, but actually I didn't progress anywhere because I'm still in the first 4. Okay, but no problem. Okay. Maybe sometimes I teach in a private college, a Unicorn College, which gives you degrees in science, in IT, and in economy, and I teach front-end development. And when I spare sometimes, I write elephants. You know, or I travel, of course. But you know, riding an elephant, it's a nice thing. You learn a lot, because the best way, the only civilized way, how to make elephant to go somewhere where you want to go, is to make him think is the best and coolest thing to do in the world to go there. And second, that was his idea. And those 2 ideas are very important when you manage 2,000 people in a company, because it's the best way how you can manage the company. Okay, so enough marketing about Unicorn, and let's switch to React Context. Let's start with a good old prop drilling problem. Anyone who develops in React knows this. When you want to gather some information, some data at the top of the application, in our example, it's an authentication information. So you log in your user in your application, and now you need to pass this data down your component tree and put it somewhere, 20th level component where you will actually render this data. So there are many ways how to do so. The most obvious way in React is called prop drilling. So you basically pass the props manually during the whole tree of components down to the level where you need to render them. Okay, it works, but seems awkward, I think, because especially when your tree is quite deep, and it's always when you develop a large application, there's a lot of repetition, a lot of code you have to rewrite. If you want to rename a prop, add a prop, remove a prop, it's a nightmare. So this is maybe not the best way how to do it. So there are some ways how to avoid this. The first one, which will everyone tell you, okay, leave the state somewhere, make some singleton JavaScript, and maintain the change of the state somehow, implement some event-driven system or something. This is a common way in other frameworks, not in React. So another option, of course, good advice, do better component composition. When your tree is too deep, rewrite your components to make it shallow, rearrange components. Well, it's nice and easy advice, but it's very hard to implement. It's not always easy to do this. So when you start to Google how to avoid building problem, you'll find Redux. Maybe it will first or second hit when you do this. Of course, you can implement Redux. So you start reading Redux documentation, and you read about reducers and global state, etc. It's not easy for the first reading, and first not easy to integrate. So have you heard about React Context? It's quite a new feature. It's in React. It's quite a short time, for 1 year, but it solves the prop drilling problem very effectively because it provides the way how you can pass your data through the component tree just directly where you need to, without doing prop drilling, without manually copying props on each level. So this avoids prop drilling problem. It avoids the rendering of all the components, because the side effect of prop drilling is that when the prop on each level change, it triggers render on each level, and you have to go pass through the renders. Fortunately, React is quite good in updating your HTML document object model, but still there's some extra work your browser needs to do when it's not needed. Okay, so React Context does this, and now I will show you in a few slides the API and how it's super simple to use it. And then we go through some deeper problems and deeper things we found out in our stack, and typical mistakes our developers made when they introduced React Context into the application. Typically, React Context is used for global or session settings, like this obvious authentication. It may be language internalization. It may be theming. Most of speeches about React Context are about theming your application, about changing colors and background pictures. We will touch to that later, of course. We can avoid it. Time zones anymore. Maybe we will see React Context is good enough to manage your application state just out of the box without introducing any other tool into your stack, without using Redux, MobX, or other. Okay, let's go to the API. The API, I told you, is super simple. There are just few methods you need to know to use React Context, just 2 components you need to know. And let's show some code, it will be better. First, how to create a context. There's a React create context method, and when you call it, it actually provides you an object which contains 2 new components. One is called provider, is the component which holds the data, the contextual data you need to pass through your component tree. And that's the component when, if you need to change the context value, you change it on provider level. And second, it will provide you consumer component, which is the component you include into your subcomponents in the subtree, and which will allow to consume the data from the provider, and which will trigger render anytime provider changes the value. So the most easy way is just to call create context. It will create a new context, new 2 components, or you can use default value for a provider value right away. So when you pass the first argument to React create context, it will give you default values for the your context. Then you need to place those new components somewhere in your component tree. First, you need to place a provider. provider will be usually the topmost or one of the topmost components in your component tree. It will be somewhere around app, page, somewhere on top, because consumers work only when they are in the context of the provider, of course. So there need to be children somewhere in the subtree of the provider. So we place to our page content component, which from the name it looks like a topmost component in the application. We will place my user context provider, and provider has just one value, just one prop. The prop is called value, and you can pass anything to this prop, anything you can pass to any other prop in React. So it might be number, it might be string, it might be null, it might be, of course, an object, yeah, and which is the most typical usage of provider value. And you render your children, and then notice that you don't use just consumer, you use myUserContext.consumer, because this context is about user. So those components are created by React specially for this context. We will touch this later because we can have more contexts in one application. Okay, now you take your myUserContext consumer and render it in your application, which should be context sensitive, basically which renders the data from the context. You pass the data from the consumer to some components by calling children as a function. You should everybody know how to do it. So I used directly some nice destructuring of the value. So extract username and user photo from the context and pass it here to image, which will render the photo, and to some div which will render name, easy peasy. Okay, so this is my consumer. Actually, in React 16.6, which is available since last week, so it's like 1 week old information, you have another way how you can consume your context inside your child component. You can just assign context type. I'm using here, of course, experimental, but very useful syntax of JavaScript classes. So I define static property for the class and assign the context type, this myUserContext. I've imported from the module where I created it. And now you can access the context like you would access state or props. So when you want to access user photo, you just go to this.context.userPhoto, context.username will be your name. And if you use this in your render function, the render will be treated anytime context will be changed. So when it will be changed, we will touch. So this is easy peasy and very simple syntax for using context. When you are using just one context in your application, is the best way how to integrate, and very easy to understand for everybody who's familiar with props and state. Okay. So here's the result of our context. Your new component tree looks much better because you just pass your authentication props on the top level. All your intermediate components doesn't need to drill down props down there. And even your user profile component, which renders the data from the authentication, doesn't need to get those props because it will get them from the context. So you see the code on the right side, much better to understand, much better to maintain. Okay, so this is the context API, and now some hints. First, it's true that anytime provider changes its value, it will re-render all the consumers. Yeah. So when provider changes the value, it's the same when prop value in React change. So if it's a number, then if there's a different value in number, the value changed and the render will be triggered. If it's a string, the same. If it's an object, of course, the object reference must change to trigger. So the first common mistake I found in our code and many places was, of course, we need to pass an object. So let's take our context values from somewhere. It doesn't need to be explained here from where. And let's create an object directly in the JSX and pass it to the value. OK, this works, but actually it works too much. Because this syntax means that anytime this user context provider gets rendered, new object is created from those values. So anytime parent component renders, provider will be rendered, and it will re-render all consumer components. So it might be quite a lot of overhead. Okay, because actually there's no should component update from context function in the lifecycle. Hey, React, maybe you should add this, but currently not. So when the value of provider is triggered, all consumers will re-render. So on the other hand, when you just pass a reference to an object, which is defined somewhere in your code, and then you change the object keys, the object reference will not change. The provider will not render your consumers. So what's the solution? Well, the best solution is let React do his work, what it does best. And what is React very good in? It's changing and managing the state of the component. So my advice how to manage the value of the provider would be lift the value to the state of the parent component. So we have here in the component state this user context key which contains our values. And in provider, we assign the value to the state. Now, if you change the state in the React proper way, not directly by using React sex state, of course, anytime the user context changes, this will re-render, it will render consumers. Very easy and maybe the best way. You can, of course, lift it to props, but then you can manage object references, change, etc. When you lift it to state, React will do this for you and you need to care for it. Okay. Another advice, when your context is a set of objects with distinct values, but you don't change each property of the object anytime, maybe the good way would be to lift them to some module, name those object values, and then just assign a string to your context, because strings is compared by value every time in JavaScript. So when the string changes, you will render, of course, in your consumer component, you then need to import those. This is the theming, of course. I told you that we can't avoid it in a React context speech. You can import themes, and you get your value from this object. So this is another good practice how to use context. Another good practice, sometimes, many times actually, you need to trigger the update of the whole context from some consumer, because something down in your application tree changes, and you need to trigger the context change. So what's the best way how to get to your provider and how to trigger the change? Well, again, very easy React practice. Create a handler, a function actually in a parent component, which will change the state of the parent component, which will change the context, and pass the reference to this function to your context. So if you do it this way, I'm again using this experimental property, but in this case private property class syntax. If you do it this way, you can pass, and you can call it from any consumer. Okay. Actually, there's no need to have just one context in your application. If you have different context values and different consumers, basically components which will render on different keys which change in your context, don't put them in one context, create more contexts, and render more contexts. This is the advice over here. Another advice is that it looks like context is global, but it's not true, because consumer goes through the component tree and always finds the closest appropriate provider. So if you need to change your context in your subtree, and for one part of the subtree have a different tree of different value of context, for another part different value, you can do it just by rendering another provider of the same type inside your component tree. Easy example: if you want to have a component which will render headings, and you don't want to count about the headings. You just want to, when you put your component inside another component, it will find out on which level it is, and it will render proper heading level. And when you put another component inside this component, it will again render the proper heading level. You do it just this. You can be just one component which renders consumer on the top level, consumer finds out if there is context already. If not, it will create one, and it will update the level. Actually, it will add one to this level. And then you can render anything, and if you put this component inside somewhere in the subtree, it will be the proper level. It will increase it, and for the subtree there will be an increased level of those. Of course, this is a very simple example. There might be different ways how to do it, but I think you get the idea how you can change the way. Actually, we've used it in one of our applications for a very difficult task, because we have a document authoring application called Bookit, and it allows you to author online documentation in many languages parallelly. It's the best way how to do it for someone who wants to translate it, show him the original documentation and translations to other languages in one place. So we have one language for the application, and each section has its own language, and the author can switch between languages, and this is done through React Context. It works very well for hundreds of sections in one page, so it's very fast. How fast is it? Actually, it's very fast. When you consider React Context, performance shouldn't be an issue. We've tried that thousands of consumers in one page is not a problem. Yeah? So with providers, it's a bit more difficult, but your providers should be sparse in your tree, but hundreds of providers are okay as well. So it's generally faster than Redux because it's built in, it's less complex, so performance is not an issue. Okay, can it be used for state management of the whole application? In my opinion, and strongly opinionated opinion, yes, of course. It's nice a built-in way. You don't need to introduce Redux, MobX, or any other tool into your stack. But maybe when you already did and you are familiar with Redux, there's no need to throw it away and replace for React Context. It will work almost the same. And generally, React Context is much easier to learn for beginners. So yes, I think set state clearly solved the state of component, maybe the best in the market, and create context solves the application state out of the box in React. Okay, that's it. And questions and answers.
All right, thank you, David. We have a couple of questions for you. Ready?
Okay, perfect.
You sure?
Yeah.
All right, we have a very popular one here. How does this scale? Is it really an alternative to Redux, other state management libraries in a big application?
Well, maybe I answered in one of the last slides. It scales very well, but on the other hand, if you want to use it efficiently, you have to think about more contexts. You have to split your context according to the way it's updated. So the thinking about React Context, I think it's more difficult to comparing to Redux when you know how to use it, because Redux does this work for you. You don't need to think about if this part updates different way, I have to introduce another Redux. So if you use it carefully, it can scale perfectly, but it needs more architecting than Redux, I would say, in this part.
All right, okay. Our next question. Can a component subscribe to multiple contexts?
Of course it can. You just render consumers inside a component, one inside other, and you can consume the context of as many providers as you want. Okay.
All right. Next one from Robert. Does Context API work with pure components?
Well, of course it does. Yeah, but there's no. It's React. The consumer is just a component. So when you render a consumer inside a pure component, it will work.
Next one from Anonymous. How to create presentational components with React Context API?
Well, I'm not sure if I understand the question perfectly. But if you mean that you want to change the context of the render of some presentational component according to context, it's just easy. I've shown you. Of course, it's always a good practice, and I think it was there in one of the presentations last day. If you split your components to just presentational and logic, so comparing to React or using React Context, it would mean that your provider should stay in some higher order component, in some non-visual component, which will maintain application state and logic. and you render your consumers inside your presentational component because they will contextually render whenever the context changes. Okay.
Next question from Ina. Is this a good practice to use React context together with Redux, MobX, or other state manager? Or should developer avoid using solutions together?
Well, of course, it depends on your stack and your architecture. From the developer's perspective, less tools in your stack means less complexity, easier learning curve. So if you can avoid it, avoid it. But there might be some good reasons. For example, when you use Redux for managing state of your application data and use context just for theming or other global settings, I would say, in your application, that might be a good way. By the way, Redux React connector uses context behind the hood, so there's no performance bottleneck or something when you use it together. Just complexity of your code. Okay.
All right, Lucas Box would like to know, so context type injects context props to my child component. Seems magic. Confused smiley face.
Okay, it doesn't actually. Of course, I've used some experimental syntax for class, but if you want to avoid this, you just assign to your class, to your class identifier, you just assign .context type and you assign context to it, and it's no magic. This is just the proposed syntax for JavaScript classes. Okay.
All right, probably time for one more question from Checkmate. I like that one. Good from you. Is there any specific reason to set the state to equal context and then passing state rather than passing the context directly?
Well, there is one, and that's what I said, that React is really very good when managing and updating state. So when you update your state key for your context, actually what React does by calling setState, it will create a new instance of your object within the state. So the object gets new reference ID, and when you pass it to the context, it will render. If you pass directly, you have to manage this alone. So that's the reason why it's better to do it by state. Of course, it's possible. You can develop it by yourself, no problem.
All right, and that's all we have time for. Please give a very warm round of applause for David. Thank you very much.
Thank you.